We're also joined by our European correspondent, i24news, Jonathan Sacerdoti, in London, in Britain. Good morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning, Yael.
You'll be staying with us this half hour, but I want to check with you firstly around Europe reactions to this heinous, horrific attack in Paris.
As Marie said to you there, the people of France came out onto the streets to show their solidarity against this form of terrorism. And the same has been happening across Europe, with similar, if smaller, rallies taking place. Even here in London at Trafalgar Square yesterday evening, people started to gather holding similar signs, Je suis Charlie, showing their solidarity against this kind of terrorism. And across Europe, people are standing up against what they see as a brutal challenge to democracy and freedom of speech, as well as the sanctity of human life. David Cameron, of course, condemning this very early on in the day, alongside Angela Merkel, who was in London for a prearranged visit.
The reactions this morning in the press around Europe, what are the reactions to that attack? This does feel for Europeans, especially for the French people, like they're 9/11, so it seems.
The press have been almost unanimous across all of Europe, with front covers set aside entirely for this story, either as many here in the United Kingdom have done, with that harrowing picture of the policeman on the pavement, his hands in the air, pleading not to be killed, and then those two killers shooting him without even breaking pace in their running, or entire front pages stating Je suis Charlie and their solidarity with Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, after the killers declared that they had killed Charlie as they were heard leaving the scene of the crime. So it's pretty much unanimous across Europe that the press is standing up against this, saying that they, in fact, will be made stronger, not weaker, by this sort of attack on the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech. And the same is true of the citizens and the leadership of all the different nations of Europe, as far as one can tell, surveying the newspapers and the newswires this morning. People are adamant that this should not weaken Europe, and it should not weaken this absolute resolve that democracy, freedom of speech, and freedom are the key factors which make Europe what it is, which make European countries what they are, especially in France, where this separation of religion and state is such a key, fundamental part of their society and their culture. It's almost ridiculous to them to imagine that these sorts of things are happening now with some increased regularity. And that's an important thing also for us to note, that this is not an isolated incident in France. Over the last month, even week or two, there have been increasing so-called lone wolf attacks, as they were originally labeled. But, once you have a series of these sorts of attacks taking place, it's harder to say that they're not part of a concerted, at least, trend that is taking place. And we saw even the arrest of the man who had the gun believed to have been used, this is last June, in that killing of 4 people at the Jewish Museum in Brussels. We had over the last few weeks across different parts of France, different incidents where Islamists were believed to have taken part in attacks. And we also had yesterday word from the French, as soon as this had happened, as soon as this news had broken of the Charlie Hebdo attack, that there had been other foiled attacks also taking place. So really, France is in the throes of some sort of tidal wave of these sorts of attacks, as far as one can talk of such a thing. And the whole of Europe is on alert for these similar attacks taking place elsewhere.
The Islamic State organization apparently comes out with a statement a short while ago praising this attack, not taking responsibility for it, but of course jumping on the bandwagon. I don't know if you had the chance to see that already, Jonathan, but reactions lumping together this incident and the Islamic State organization, has that been raised already this morning in Europe?
And not just the Islamic State organization. Also, there were reports in Lebanese media of there being celebratory gunfire in Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. For example, what is unavoidable is the connection of these sorts of things to extremist Islam around the world. And that is exactly what you heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying just there in his statement. And the questions that are being asked now in Europe are, how are these highly trained killers using high-caliber weapons, who were apparently in possession also of rocket launchers, able to undertake something like this without there being some sort of intelligence on them, having been trained somewhere, perhaps Syria, perhaps Iraq, we don't know yet, having had already some connections to extremism in the past. We know that Sharif Kouachi had been sentenced to 3 years in prison in Paris for helping to funnel prospective jihadi fighters from France to Iraq, and served 18 months with the remainder of that sentence, in fact, suspended. The New York Times first wrote about him in 2005 when it was reported that he'd become inspired to fight jihad due to the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuses, and prior to that, he'd not been a devout Muslim. He'd had girlfriends, smoked and drank, they say in these reports. So we are now finding that European leaders and European people are asking all these important questions. How is this unfolding on European soil? How much more of it is there to come? And there are people here in Britain, security specialists that I've been speaking to, are simply saying, when will this happen in the UK? Not, will this happen in the UK?
Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you for joining me on this very sad morning. A grave morning for freedom of speech all around the world. When we get back, a new study takes a deep